This morning we'll be reading from Ephesians 4, verses 1 through 6. I, therefore, the prisoner in the Lord, beg you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. Amen.
Just before the beginning of my third year in college, I was in my hometown for the summer, working at True Value hardware store, preparing to live abroad in Costa Rica for the semester. It was an early morning and I had an appointment before work, and my alarm went off, not the normal annoying of those days, but instead the radio option where the local station came on, and I just sort of let it play, lazily waited, my eyes closed, trying to wake up. And then I heard the words about New York City and the Twin Towers. It was September 11th, 2001, just after 6 a.m. in California. Both of the towers had been struck. The world was just beginning to receive the news, not yet processing our new reality. My sister lived in New York City, and her father-in-law worked just around the corner from the towers at the stock exchange. I had recently visited both of them and been on the ground just there where the news was striking. I was worried about them, so I called my sister, and like everyone else trying to call the city that day, got no answer. I went to the hospital for my appointment, watching the news, seeing things unfold with everyone else. Some had seen the news already, were trying to make sense of it. Others came in blindly. What's going on? What are you talking about? And then I went to the hardware store where we turned the radio up at the front door, glued to it for more news, more understanding. And as people came in and out that day, we just grieved together, processed together a little bit the shock, the confusion, the bewilderment, the fear. And in the coming days, we sold out of American flags. Learned they were back ordered across the country from here and there and everywhere. We started to recognize our unity in our prayers and in our fears, and the confusion and the frustration and even some of the anger. On 9/11, my parents were on a cruise ship up the East Coast. They happened to be in Canadian waters, which meant they stayed in Canadian waters. The borders were closed, travel was halted, airplanes were grounded. It was several days before they could return to American waters, and several days including before they could contact their family. There are 12 cousins on that side. All of our parents were there. None of us had news. We were so relieved when we finally heard from them and gave them a gentle-ish reprimand for not calling sooner. We'd been worried. I wasn't scheduled to fly to Costa Rica until the end of the month. I was fortunate I didn't have to change any of my plans. I was on one of those early flights out once they had restored international travel. I remember distinctly being handed a spoon with the cold butter to spread on my bread. I don't know if you traveled in those days, but there were no forks or knives, including plasticware, that were available on the planes. I was in my early 20s, coming of age, traveling the world for the first time, first there in Costa Rica, and then the next semester in Spain, Portugal, Morocco, and Gibraltar. I remember being in Costa Rica after one of our weekend excursions, our group of American students arriving back to San Jose on the bus, ready to get off and get home, and our Costa Rican director pausing us, struggling to find the words to tell us that the news had come that the U.S. had invaded in Afghanistan. I was young enough that the only other war I remembered was Desert Storm. And while I knew it was a thing, I was never close to it. The only person I knew who was deployed was my fourth grade teacher's husband, who came back to share his stories and his witness with us. And the most memorable part of that to my 9-year-old mind was the MREs. I was both privileged and lucky that war never marched through my home or my family in some of the ways that it has yours. We hadn't faced those losses or lived with the fear of what if they never come home. The events of 9/11 and my travels and the ensuing conflict were significant events that happened as I learned to examine myself and my view of the world, deciding for myself what I would think, not just receiving what I had inherited from my culture and my family. When I lived abroad, I started to read the local papers, both in English and in Spanish. It won't sound surprising now, but in those days, I kind of thought we were all on the same page. I'd only read American papers, probably sort of similar to what maybe you had seen Los Angeles Times was normal in our family. And as I read those papers, I saw the same facts that I found in the US papers, but the perspectives were different. I was shocked by that. I was humbled by that. I never knew how much our cultural context, our native context, our national context informed the things we believe, the things we hear, the things we see in the news. I could probably talk for days about my stories and time abroad, the things that I learned, the things that shaped me and changed me. But today, what I want to focus on is how much it opened my eyes to the diversity of our world, to how we understand things and how we interact with other people, to how we learn and explore and grow. And how doing all that growth with the backdrop of 9/11 right there informed how I interpreted my role as an American in foreign countries. I, self-designated probably, became an American ambassador. I saw myself as a representative of the United States and other Americans, and I wanted to do that well. My truth was, I struggled with the war. I struggled with President Bush. I struggled with what people said about us and our president and our conflict. And I struggled with how people might understand me as an American in light of those things. I wasn't ready to be out protesting the war, but I also really wasn't ready to be proud to be an American in that war. I wasn't rife with conflict, but there was an internal tension for me, and that tension made me mindful of how I entered a space or a country and how I interacted with people. It's not just storytelling time for me. That's the long, winding road that sets the backdrop for me when I come to this passage in Ephesians 4, which talks about living a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called and describes that as embodied through humility, gentleness, patience, and love. In many ways, because of those experiences and how they shaped me in my early adulthood, I can't hear this passage without that lens. It informs my reading. In those early days in my young adulthood, I was focused on what it meant to be an American, a representative to the world. When I read this passage from Ephesians, I hear the question of what it means to be a Christian, a representative to the world. I am aware not just of what I believe it means to be a Christian, but also what other people think it means, and how the ways I choose to act and interact don't just reflect on me, they reflect on us as Christians and ultimately on Christ himself. In many ways, I believe we are called to be Christian ambassadors into the world, ambassadors of the faith, representing Jesus to others, mindful of how we act and interact, aware of a diversity of perspectives, both among us and beyond us, encouraged and invited to explore with curiosity and openness, and aware of the harm that has happened in the name of the one we claim. I hope that we expect to try and represent Jesus in ways that reflect the best of him and not the worst of Christians. And I want to be clear, I do not want to be overly concerned with what other people think about me. At the end of the day, I don't control what you think about me or what anybody else thinks about me. But I don't want to be dismissive of it either, because it's likely that what you think about me comes from my words, my actions, and my example. In those early days of travel, I would sort of imagine, what if I were the only American someone ever met? What if everything they believed about Americans was based on how I acted? What would they think of all of us? Or what if I were the only Christian someone met? What if their assumptions about Christians were based on my behavior? What would they believe that we are about? This one's far more common. What if I were the only female clergy person someone met? That still happens regularly. What would they think about other clergy women if I was the only one they knew? As an American or as a Christian, would you want to be associated with my example or guilty of my actions? And what if that applied not just to me or to other pastors, but to you, to each of us? What if you are the ambassador called to live a life worthy of the calling? What would people see in you or because of you? Would they see gentleness, humility, patience, and love? Would those around you be pleased to bear the burden of your reputation? As we draw close to the election and then the days and the weeks that will follow, I want us to be mindful of our role in the world. How will we represent Christ? It's very unlikely that you're the only Christian someone knows, let alone the only American. But what if you were the only United Methodist someone met? How will you represent us to others? Are you willing to share the burden of the reputation that we are creating in the community and the world around us? I want to close with a different story. This one fast forwards us from 2001 to 2008. I was beginning my ministry as the sole pastor at Wesley United Methodist Church in Riverside, California. From day one in my time there, we had homeless folks sleeping on our steps and showering in our sprinklers on the front lawn, which sat on a major road in our sizable city of 300,000. At first, including my first Sunday, the church folks just wanted the homeless people gone. One man proudly came to me, "I got them to leave, Pastor." Said, "Did you invite them to stay? Next time you might try that." I gently reminded us that we are called to do something more than get people to move along. And so we started learning names, stories, and people, including their needs. And as we engaged with them as people, as individuals, they weren't just homeless. We began to connect and build relationships. Things began with Alan and David, and then Jimmy and Carlos, Kuka and little Alan, which distinguished him from the first. As we invested in a few, word began to spread. We were a good place to go, and more folks came. We started a feeding ministry, and then a shower ministry, and a clothes closet, and a Bible study. And when people would come on Sunday mornings, they would often bring their shopping carts with all their belongings. They'd park them out front and then come inside for a meal or a shower. One day, one of our members who helped with the breakfast meal came across the street to the parsonage where I live to talk with me. She was concerned. She was worried about what we were doing. She was worried about what people would think about us as the church with all those shopping carts out front on the lawn. She thought it looked dirty and messy, like we didn't care. She meant it looked like we didn't care about appearances, about how people saw us, and I thought she was probably right. She was frustrated. I was delighted. As a church, I was perfectly okay with people seeing that we worked with those people. The vagabonds, the street people, the unhoused. I was proud of our church and the work they were doing to care for people in need, offering grace through a hot meal, a hot shower, some clean clothes, and being treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what had transpired the night before. I was more than okay being known as that church. When I push on how we are living in the world, with the reputation that we are creating and with how people perceive us, I want you to know that I'm not after some glossy, idealized version of flawless Christians. I want us to be authentic. I want people to know we are real people who face real problems and that sometimes, oftentimes, we're our own kind of mess. I want people to know that when we proclaim we believe in Jesus, it means something significant for how we live. That we aren't just consumed with our own well-being or welfare, but deeply invested in others. I hope it means we risk being that church with those people. Not just the homeless, though certainly including them, but anyone our community pushes to the margins. I want our faith to be so grounded in the gospel that we can't help but get a little messy loving people, caring for their physical, emotional, and spiritual needs, regardless of what might have transpired the night before. I believe we are called to be Christian ambassadors in the world. With humility, dignity, gentleness, patience, and love. And I know full well that dealing with messy people gets us a little bit messy too. It sounds a little bit shiny right here. It's harder than that. It requires much more patience than that. But we are called to live a life worthy of the calling. That is our task. May it be our witness. Amen.